1. So for this to make sense, I have to add in a backstory that goes way back to when my mom was around 6. My mom recently told me her part of the story, so that's what I'm writing here. Her, my aunt, who was 5 at the time, and my grandparents had moved to an old farmhouse on about 50 acres of land in Alexandria, Minnesota. It had an old run-down 2-story house and an equally old, equally run-down, stereotypical barn about 50 meters away with a hayloft. She said that ever since they moved there she felt weird whenever being on the property, but didn't think much of it because she was young. The first month or so was harmless enough. She would occasionally hear noises at random times, but chalked it up to the house being old. Then, after that first month or so, she looked out the barn and noticed the hayloft's doors were open, which they never were. So she went out to see why, and the minute she stepped outside, she noticed the little boy was standing up in the hayloft. So she, being a curious child, decided to go see what was going on, but saw no one when she got to the top. She spent the rest of that day thinking she was just seeing things, but that night, she saw that same little boy in her room while she was laying in bed. She described him as being in a state of decay. His skin was all grey and shriveled to his body. His eye sockets were empty, his mouth was wide open, and he was screaming. Not very loudly, but loud enough for it to be annoying. She asked my aunt the next day if she saw him, and she said that she did. They both saw the little boy in various locations with the next couple of days, and always in her room at night. My mom eventually told the boy to stop screaming, and he did. That part really isn't all that important, but I thought it was kind of a cool detail. She continued seeing him for the next few weeks. He would never actually move, but stuff would move around in whatever room she saw him in. They eventually got used to it, because he didn't do anything violent, just thought of it as a slight inconvenience. This is where things started to turn. One night she was dozing off to sleep when she felt a weight at the foot of her bed. She looked up and saw that there was an old lady sitting at the end of her bed that, according to her, just radiated evil. She doesn't remember what her reaction was, but from that day on, things went downhill. It started off with her being pushed into the barn while playing near it, and the door being locked from the outside. At first, I thought it was maybe my aunt playing a prank on her, but she assured me that my aunt wasn't home and that the only other person around was my grandma, and she was in the house. So she was stuck in there for a couple hours before my grandparents noticed she was gone and went to look for her. A few days after that, she told me that my aunt and her were jumping on her bed, which was right next to a window. While bouncing, my mom said she could see my aunt get pushed mid-air through the window. Luckily, their room was on the first floor, so she just fell into some bushes. I asked her if she had any pictures of the aftermath, but she said they didn't have a camera back then. It's worth mentioning that up until now, my grandparents didn't believe anything they were saying about the little boy and the old lady. But now they finally started to believe them. They had the house blessed, but that only seemed to make things worse. My aunt and her started waking up in the mornings with marks on their backs, again would provide pictures had they a camera to document it. They also started hearing someone whisper, "Get out," to them at night. But the thing that finally made them decide to leave was when my grandparents and them saw a knife get pulled out of the knife block and drop on the floor. They left practically the next day. A few years later, my mom and aunt looked into the history of the house to see what was going on. All she was able to find out was that the mother, the old lady she saw, suffered from some mental disorder. She doesn't remember what specifically, but it was bad enough for her to have a psychotic break and kill her son, the little boy, and her daughter with a cleaver, then buried them in the yard. She would occasionally see the little boy in and around her house. They are now living in Wisconsin at this time, but she didn't see him nearly as often, and it became less frequent as she grew older. So that's the end of the backstory. Now my part of the story. Around when I was 6 or 7, I called my mom into my room one night and asked who the little boy in my room was. She asked me to describe him to her, and I told her he looked like a raisin, didn't have any eyes, and his mouth was open. Keep in mind, she hadn't told me about the little boy. So I started seeing him maybe once a month, and still do to this day. I'm 20 now. I never was freaked out by him, because he would never do anything that felt threatening. just stand there, and occasionally stuff would move around in whatever room I saw him in. But somewhat recently, within the past maybe 3 years, he hasn't been visiting me alone. Whenever I see him now, there's always an abnormally tall, dark, shadowy blob standing behind him, and I feel nothing but a mixture of dread and anger when it's around. I say it because it doesn't feel human. Whenever I see it, I immediately get rid of any sharp objects and anything that could be used as a weapon in my room, because I feel like it wants to hurt me and wants to hurt my family. I remember one instance in particular that really freaked me out. I was laying in bed watching some TV when I heard a loud and powerful bang come from the walls. I then heard a deep and menacing chuckle inside my head. I've tried taking a picture of whatever this is next to the little boy, but every time I've tried, something has stopped me. Like I'll have every intention to take the picture, but I physically can't move my fingers to take it. I occasionally burn sage in my room to try and keep this at bay, but that only works for a little bit. I recently told my mom about this dark being, and since then we've had a priest come over and do a blessing on my house every once in a while. This has seemed to keep it away, but we still have him come over a couple times a year just to make sure. I still see the little boy every once in a while, but I haven't seen that thing since getting help. Now, I know I'm probably going to get questions about why I don't have any pictures of the little boy, and to answer that, in the past I've never really felt the need to. He's just kind of been there and never given me a reason to. He's just been something I've grown up with. The last time I saw him, however, I did try to take a picture of him, but he didn't show up on it, so I just gave up attempting that. 2. My sister, her entire life, has been able to see the dead and communicate with them. She says that for people like her that can see them, they are like a beacon of light to spirits, so they all flock to her. Growing up, she would constantly be bombarded by spirits telling her to tell my son I'm okay, or pass on some message to loved ones, or simply be basically harassed by them. Apparently many of them just kind of meander around in a confused state, almost unaware of what's going on around them. She finally found a way to keep control of her power where she can almost shut it off when she needs to, but she can never completely block it out. She got to the point where she wanted to start using her abilities to help people. She's an amazing tarot card reader, practices Wicca, and has drawn spirits out of numerous homes. I worked at a gas station that was severely haunted. Lots of people had experiences there, including customers and employees. We all worked our shifts by ourselves there, and would all experience the same things. Whistling like someone is working, seeing a shadow man, things being moved, cigars thrown at you, etc. We ended up naming him Sam. One of my co-workers was literally chased out of the building by Sam one night. She heard footsteps rushing after her, and she ran right out of the door, and didn't even turn back to lock the building up because it chased her all the way out. She had to call our manager to get there to lock up for her because she was never going back there again. Random customers would bring up seeing a shadow person down an aisle. Once I had a little girl, around 5 years old, ask me if I believed in ghosts when she was paying for her candy. I told her, no, that's silly, because I didn't want to scare her. She told me, well, I just saw a ghost back there, and pointed to the back coolers. It finally got to the point where the gas station owner wanted to do something about it. I told him all about my sister and how she could probably help him. He gave her permission to come in after close and get the spirit out of there. The next day, my sister came in after I locked the place up for the night. My mom came as well to watch. She slowly walked around the store. It wasn't long before she stopped in her tracks and gasped. She stood there for a while and cried a few tears. She described to me what she saw. She said that he presented himself as a man, about his mid-30s, was wearing old work coveralls. His arm was barely hanging there from his shoulder and was mangled. She compared it to what it is like when you twist and twist the stem off of an apple, and it is barely hanging on. She said there was lots of blood. He had apparently died in a farming accident on some farm that used to be near the property many years ago. He was confused, and didn't really know he was dead. My sister smudged the entire place with sage and did some weird kind of ritual-like stuff. I wasn't sure exactly what she was doing. She then set a mirror up on the wall that was straight across from the front door. She said that doing this will help show him the way out. Some time went by, and then she said that he had left and finally moved on. It was a strange feeling all of a sudden, almost like you were completely surrounded by peace. Ever since this happened, nothing paranormal has happened at that gas station. 3. My parents decided to leave Texas in the mid-80s. My dad couldn't find work, so it was a toss-up between California or Florida, and my parents chose Florida. Fast forward. My parents found a great house to rent from a very religious family that lived behind us and across the street. After some renting the home from the family for about 2 or 3 years, the family suffered some personal stuff that I will not go into, but the father tried to kill himself in the garage. The family moved out and asked if we would like to purchase their house. The home we were living in at that time was going to be sold to help the family financially for a while. My parents said yes, so we moved from a 3-bedroom rental to a 4-bedroom and ownership. My grandmother, who lived with us, got a room, and my sister and I got our own instead of having to share a room. Anyway, even though I was younger, I got the biggest room because my older sister was never really at home, and I am an introvert, so I was always there, and, well, I got the biggest room besides the master suite. My sister only partially complained, but also realized that, yeah, she was never gonna be home, so what does it matter how big her room was? My friends always wanted to come to my house because it's big and your parents don't bother you. I have great friends, but my sister and I have always been very independent and capable. They never had to worry about us. We also had a pool, so anyway. My first few nights in my own room, I could hear a tap noise here and there. No big deal, it's hot in Florida, and wood expands and contracts, etc. New house, new noises. Want to mention, we had huge power lines that went by the house. My friends and I were very much into the magic arts. We never did anything mean or anything evil, it just felt right. We would play the Ouija board in my room. I already had an attachment, but I didn't know what that was at the time. After a year or two, my friends and I had experienced many things. I soon realized that the tapping that I heard was not the wood contracting, but something else. I would prove that my room was haunted by requesting the spirits tap a certain number of times. Some people reacted with surprise, and some thought I was doing it somehow, even though they never found anything in my closet when I took them to look. One day, one of my best friends was stopping by after flag practice and brought 3 of her flag corps group over so she could grab a gift I bought her. As they came in, she warned them that my house was weird and very haunted. Well, they didn't believe her and said, yeah, sure. I knew them, of course, as well. We all go to school together. One of the girls needed to use my bathroom. My friend takes her there because the bathroom is near my room, and that was where the gift was. The thought comes in my head as I was talking to the other 2 girls. She is going to compliment you on your toilet paper. A few minutes pass and my friend calls to me, and I leave the 2 other girls for a moment, standing in the kitchen next to the laundry room and garage door. It turns out I was out of TP, and the girl in the potty needed a roll, so I handed her some and went back to the other 2. The 2 girls are looking at me with these huge eyes. They say, I think your dad is home and he sounds mad. The other said, he's yelling, should we leave? I said, my dad? No, he doesn't yell. He doesn't have to. I walk to the garage, open the door and show them. No one is there. Suddenly, the girl that needed to use the bathroom comes back and says, your 2-ply is awesome. I smile. The other girls are freaking and my friend comes from my room with her gift. The 2 others swear they heard a man yelling in the garage. I again say, no one is here but us. They left, just turned around and walked out. They told my friend they now believe and never want to go there again. My house, in about 10 minutes, turned 2 skeptics into believers. I have a theory of what these girls heard. That summer I was outside washing and fixing my bike as me and my best male friend were going to ride our bikes to the comic book store. Yes, I am a nerd. Suddenly a man stops his truck and gets out of it and walks up to me. He was frantic, crying as he spoke to me. I am about 15 at the time. His son was just killed by a huge entertainment center that had fallen on him, and he needed a place to put the damn thing. I ran into the house and called for my dad. He came running out and the man explained to my dad that he couldn't bear to look at it. But they couldn't just throw it out as they needed it for the investigation, etc. Of course, my dad said yes, and together they lifted this huge cabinet out of the bed of the truck. It stayed there until it was no longer needed, maybe a week. I went out later that night and looked at it. It still had the child's blood on it, and I just lost it. I started to cry. That poor child. That poor family. I believe that some of that tragic energy stayed in my garage, and the girls heard maybe a playback, a residual sound from that day. Or from the previous family. The father did try to kill himself in there. 4. This story takes place in December 2017. Strange things continued until spring 2018, eventually stopping once I moved away in the summer. I left for basic training upon graduating high school in the summer of 2014, then was stationed in Colorado in January 2015, so I wasn't home unless I was on leave. During my first year in the Army, my best friend that I grew up with, and who sometimes lived with me, died while I was away. I was never granted permission to go home and say goodbye because he was not considered immediate family. In December 2017, I finished my 3.5-year enlistment with the Army, and was living at home again, until I embarked on college for the fall semester. When I was home this time, things felt different. A lot of memories from growing up suddenly rushed back to me. I was only 21 and still pretty tore up over the loss of my friend. I decided to go to the cemetery on Christmas. It was the first time I'd worked up the courage to see where he was buried. I sat there, talking to his grave like he was with me, cried, and headed home. 3 days later, weird things began happening that would continue regularly until I moved away. I'm hanging out with my brother and 2 friends in the living room on the couch, watching TV. The way the living room is set up, the couches are facing away from the area you enter the living room, so your back is turned to the entrance. They basically form an L, with my buddy and I sharing the couch, which was completely faced away from the room entrance. I all of a sudden hear footsteps fast approaching from the other room, but it's a slapping sound that bare feet make on a hardwood floor. I assume it's my younger sister, so I was turning around, preparing some sarcastic remark. When I turn, my eyes are hit with that slight breeze you feel when someone passes by real quick. The slapping feet on the hardwood floor walk right past us, accompanied by some form of mist, continuing to the wall. I turn toward my friend sitting next to me, whose frozen face has tears running down it. He says, You saw that too, right? My other friend and my brother, sitting on the opposite couch, have their mouths slightly agape, eyes wide. I felt completely frozen, almost too afraid to move. What made this so terrifying is that these and future events to come were nearly always in front of an audience, so I couldn't just blame it on my mind playing with me. A few days later, I had a group of maybe 8 of my friends over, and we gathered in the same living room. This was our consistent friend group in high school. This was the holidays, so most of my friends were home from college, and I hadn't seen some of them in a while. If our deceased friend was still alive, he would have surely been there. Behind the couches, there was a very nice bar that my parents had built in this room, so we're all kind of spread out through the room, some on couches, some on bar stools. I am on the same couch as the previous night, back turned away to the bar and room entrance. The bar stools were around 15 years old at that point, so some of them make noise when the chair rotates. My brother and my friend are seated at the bar. When they watch the empty chair behind the bar rotate, saying, "Yo, Jay, this shit is getting weird," I look back to see a ball of light between their heads, maybe the size of a baseball, flicker like one of those old 1940s camera flashes, and it illuminates the entire room. My brother and my friend nearly fell out of their stools. I look back toward the rest of the room, and it's clear they've all seen it too. We're all kind of nervously laughing because it doesn't seem threatening. But also, what the fuck? There were only 2 occasions later on that came off as trying to alarm, both happening in my bedroom. There was knocking on the wall coming from the far side of my room, and I was trying to fall asleep. I tried ignoring it, but it would continue in short bursts, pausing, and then another few knocks, almost as if to say, "Come on, I know you hear me." Eventually I yelled out, "Yo, that's enough!" And immediately a set of knocks were on the wall closest to my bed. I yell out, "What the fuck?" Jump out of bed. My mother is downstairs and can hear me yelling. And here is her 21-year-old Army veteran son in his underwear in the kitchen yelling about the house being haunted. The second time happened to my friend in my room while I was showering. He's sitting at my desk on the computer and sees the symbol from my drum kit kind of shake. Him witnessing the other events, he stops and looks at it, and explains it was like someone drove their fist down on top of the symbol hard enough to knock it down. My question is, could this all be my deceased friend? Or should my parents consider having the house blessed? 5. The best possible time in my life so far has been when I lived in this 2-story house in a fairly big suburban town. I hold a lot of memories in this town, but the more eerie ones reside in the house that I lived in. The house I lived in was a typical suburban house that you can think of. High ceilings, small backyard, and flowers blooming everywhere in the front. Nothing about this house gave off any type of bad energy, although the boy who had to grow up in the house will tell a different story. Many strange things happened in this house that I still have trouble explaining, let alone remembering, due to the fact that I was a boy growing up with severe anxiety in a house that I didn't feel comfortable in, just trying to cope with everything. One of these encounters that I experienced was sometime in the 5th to 7th grade, while I was doing homework at the kitchen table. The kitchen was completely connected to the living room, and there was a small built-in desk that was just to the side of the kitchen counters. From the point where I was sitting at the desk would have been far in my peripheral vision to the point where I wouldn't notice anything. As I was doing my homework, my mom had walked over to the desk and was printing something or filing some papers. I didn't think too much of it, but I just had this feeling like when someone says, "Don't look in that direction," and you look in that direction. I didn't feel any bad energy or negativity. Just a random thought of curiosity that popped into my head out of nowhere. Of course, as a young boy, I feed into this curiosity and turn my head to peer over to my mom and maybe see in more detail what she was doing. As soon as I turned my head, it was like everything happened in a quick flash of a second. My head turns, only to see a figure standing right behind my mom, although facing me. Of a man in a standard business attire outfit. Black business shoes, a black briefcase in his left hand, a black suit, a black trench coat, and a black top hat. Although as soon as I turned my head, it was as if my eyes were drawn to his face. But the fact was that he didn't have one. It's as though for that quick second I could feel his gaze on me. But all that was staring right back at me was a face with skin covering completely where his eyes and mouth should be. As soon as I saw this figure, my fight or flight response was immediately triggered, and I immediately stood straight up on the kitchen chair as a sort of quick-thinking, natural body reaction. Without even blinking, just keeping my gaze in the direction of the figure, it completely vanished as if it were never there. Nothing moved. Nothing mysteriously turned on, and the energy in the room never shifted. When I had stood up, it made a fair amount of noise to the point where my mom would have looked at me and asked, "What are you doing?" Except the fact was that she just seemed to be unbothered, as if she wasn't curious why I suddenly jolted up in my chair. Past this point, I can't quite remember what happened, or if I just continued doing my homework. But to this day I will never forget, and this memory of the figure is completely embedded into my brain. A couple of years later, while growing up to be a fan of horror movies, the occult, and paranormal, I suddenly remembered this encounter and decided to do some sort of Google search on a whim to try and figure out if my typical suburban house had any history. Although what I found was that I wasn't the only one who had seen this figure before. There are multiple accounts of people seeing this figure from all over the world, to the point where he had been named the Man in the Black Suit, or the Faceless Man. Just recently I moved out of that house, and honestly, kind of miss it, and its experiences. To this day I still tell all my friends and cousins whenever we're on the topic of scary stories, and it seems to shock them. After that day I never really did see that man ever again. It's as if he had just visited me that one time in my life, and chose to never visit me again. But then again, I'm currently only 18, and still have time in my life to prove myself wrong. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 207. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. I'd also like to give a little shout out to the author of story number 2, Reddit user OminousCloud218. Thank you very much to both you and your sister for allowing us to share your experience. That was a story that took place in the spooky gas station. Well, let's see. I'm running a bit behind with my recording this week due to illness. I'm not better, but work must proceed. So, yeah, there probably won't be a stream this Saturday. And if I'm not feeling any better, there won't be a work stream next week either. We'll see. I mean, I could suddenly get a lot worse, or I could suddenly be fine by Sunday. That's how my health goes. No idea what it is. I'm hoping it's not that. I'm actually feeling very much like I was. If you remember, quite a few months back, earlier in the year, I was feeling ill as well. With the same concerns. Like, I don't really think it's that, but it's a lot of the same symptoms. But so we'll see how it goes. A lot of the same symptoms last time, and eventually just kind of faded and I got better. Yep. Anyway, with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.